Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Aileen stood at the edge of the forest, the weight of her armor heavy on her shoulders, yet comforting in its familiarity. Her sword hung at her side, a gleaming symbol of her duty as a knight. The altar of light lay just ahead, a stone structure half buried in the earth, overgrown with vines and moss, yet still radiating a faint glow. She had been stationed here for over a year now, tasked with protecting the sacred site. The world beyond the forest had grown darker, rumors of strange forces and creeping shadows reaching even this remote place. Tonight, though, something was different. The air hummed with a tension she couldn't quite place, as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting. Aileen's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her sword, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The setting sun cast long shadows across the clearing, but everything seemed still. Then she heard Ida, the soft rustle of wings. At first, she thought it was just a bird, but the sound grew louder, more labored. A flash of white appeared through the trees, and before Aileen could react, something crashed to the ground not far from the altar. Dust and debris flew up as the figure skidded across the dirt, coming to rest at the base of the stone structure. Aileen's breath caught in her throat. An angel. She had never seen one in person, only heard the stories from priests and other knights. This was not the glorious, radiant being she had imagined, though. The angel lay crumpled on the ground, one wing bent at an unnatural angle, the other dragging uselessly beside him. His robes were torn and stained with blood, and he clutched a shattered staff in his hand. Without thinking, Aileen rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. The angel's eyes fluttered open, his face pale and drawn with pain. He looked at her, his gaze piercing despite his injuries. "You a broken bar must listen," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "The light a broken bar it is fading, the darkness or broken bar has already begun to spread." Aileen's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean? What's happening?" The angel struggled to sit up, wincing as he tried to move his damaged wing. "The holy light that holds the world in balance, a broken bar is being corrupted. Dark forces seek to consume it, to plunge this world into shadow. I came a broken bar to warn you, but I was too late." His words sent a chill down Aileen's spine. The altar of light, the very thing she had sworn to protect, was now in danger. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. The angel's gaze softened, and he reached out, placing a trembling hand on her arm. "You must find the lost light. It is the only way to restore balance, to prevent the darkness from overwhelming everything." Aileen swallowed hard. "The lost light? I've never heard of it." "It is a broken bar in ancient relic," the angel explained, his voice growing weaker. "Hidden a broken bar for centuries. Only those chosen by the light can find it. You are the only a broken bar, Aileen. You are the one the light has chosen." She stared at him, stunned. Chosen by the light? She was just a knight, a guardian of a forgotten altar. How could she possibly be the one to save the world from darkness? "I can't a broken bar," she started, but the angel's hand tightened on her arm, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. "You must," he whispered. "The fate of the world a broken bar rests with you." Before Aileen could respond, the angel's grip slackened, and he slumped back against the altar, unconscious. His chest still rose and fell, but the light in his eyes had dimmed, his energy spent. Aileen stood, her thoughts racing. The fate of the world? Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of the angel's words settled over her. She had trained her whole life to protect the light, but these a broken bar, this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. She couldn't do it alone. With a deep breath, Aileen hoisted the angel onto her shoulder, careful not to aggravate his wounds. He was lighter than she expected, his frail frame a stark contrast to the strength he had displayed moments before. She began the journey back to the small village on the edge of the forest, where she knew the old healer would be able to tend to the angel's injuries. As she walked, the forest around her seemed darker, more oppressive. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches reaching out as if to snatch her away. Aileen quickened her pace, her breath coming in short bursts, until she finally emerged from the tree line and saw the village lights flickering in the distance. The healer, an old woman named Mara, took one look at the angel and ushered them both inside without a word. Aileen watched as Mara worked, her hands deftly cleaning and bandaging the angel's wounds. She felt helpless, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to answer. Once the angel was resting comfortably, Mara turned to Aileen, her expression grave. "You know what this means, don't you?" Aileen nodded, her throat tight. "I don't know where to start. I don't even know where to find the lost light." Mara sat down beside her, her withered face softening with understanding. "The light has chosen you for a reason, child. It's not about knowing the path right now. It's about trusting that you'll find the way." Aileen looked down at her hands, calloused from years of training. She had always trusted in her strength, her ability to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But these a broken bar. This was something entirely different. "I can't do this alone," she whispered, more to herself than to Mara. The old woman smiled gently. "No one ever does, my dear. But you're not alone. The angel came to you for a reason, and you'll find others along the way who will help you. Trust in the light, and trust in yourself." Aileen nodded, though her heart still felt heavy with doubt. She thanked Mara and left the small cottage, the night air cool against her skin. The village was quiet, the stars twinkling overhead, but even here, she could feel the growing presence of darkness creeping into the world. The next morning, with the angel still too weak to travel, Aileen set out alone to seek counsel from Rieger, the old mage who lived on the edge of the known world. He had been a friend to her father, and though he was a recluse now, Aileen knew he possessed ancient knowledge that could guide her. The journey was long, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. As Aileen traveled deeper into the wild lands, she encountered strange creatures, twisted shadows that seemed to grow stronger the closer she came to Rieger's domain. Each battle tested her strength, her resolve, and her growing connection to the light within her. One night, as she rested by a campfire, Aileen had a strange dream. She stood in a vast field of light, her sword glowing with a radiant energy she had never felt before. In the distance, she saw the silhouette of a grand battle light against darkness, forces clashing in a desperate struggle. And at the center of it all was her, standing tall with the power of the light flowing through her. When she awoke, her heart was pounding. The dream had felt so real, so vivid. But what did it mean? Was it a vision of the future, or just her own fears manifesting in her sleep? The next day, Aileen reached the outskirts of Rieger's home, a small, weathered tower standing alone in a desolate landscape. As she approached, the door creaked open, and the old mage stepped out, his eyes sharp despite his age. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "The light has spoken to me." Aileen felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone who could help her understand what was happening. Inside the tower, Rieger listened as Aileen recounted everything of the angel's warning, the growing darkness, and her dream of the battle. When she finished, the old mage sat in silence for a long time, his brow furrowed in thought. "The lost light is real," he said finally, his voice low. "It was hidden centuries ago, after the last great war between light and darkness. Only someone chosen by the light can find it." Aileen's heart sank. "But I don't know where to look." Rieger smiled faintly. "The light will guide you, but you must be willing to listen." Aileen wanted to protest, to demand more concrete answers, but deep down she knew he was right. She had already felt the light stirring within her, guiding her through the battles she had faced on her journey. It wasn't about knowing the path, it was about trusting the light to show her the way. Before she left, Rieger handed her a small, weathered map. "This will take you to the ruins of Eldoria. It's a dangerous place, filled with the remnants of the darkness that once consumed it. But if the lost light is anywhere, it will be there." Aileen nodded, thanking him. As she left the tower, the weight of her mission pressed down on her once again. The road ahead was perilous, but she could feel the light within her, growing stronger with each step. She wasn't just a knight anymore. She was something more. And the world was depending on her. Aileen walked away from Rieger's tower, the weight of the map in her hands feeling both like a lifeline and a burden. The path it laid out would take her through treacherous lands, but it was her only lead. She glanced at the horizon, where the sun had just begun to dip behind jagged mountains. There was no time to waste. She had to find the lost light before the darkness claimed more of the world. As she traveled, the landscapes grew harsher, more foreboding. The once vibrant forest gave way to barren, craggy hills, where twisted trees clawed at the sky and the wind howled like a distant cry for help. Aileen's steps quickened, her focus sharp. The dark forces were growing stronger, their presence more palpable with each passing day. Every night she set camp, the dreams returned. The battle, the blinding light in her hands, and the darkness, endless and consuming, always lurking at the edges of her vision. But in these dreams, something had shifted. Each time, she could feel herself growing stronger, more attuned to the light that flowed through her. It wasn't just visions anymore. She was changing, and the power was no longer dormant inside Hera. It was rising, waiting to be fully awakened. 3 days after leaving Rieger's tower, she reached the outskirts of Eldoria, the ancient ruins long abandoned by anyone who valued their life. The once great city, now a crumbled skeleton of its former glory, sprawled before her, half consumed by the earth itself. Vines choked the ruins, wrapping themselves around decaying buildings, while the few remaining spires jutted into the sky like broken swords. Shadows clung to every corner, darker and thicker than normal, as if the ruins themselves were trying to smother the light. Aileen paused, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. She could feel it. The dark forces were here, lurking in the ruins, waiting. The air itself seemed to press against her skin, thick with the weight of centuries of lost hope and forgotten battles. But beneath it all, there was something else, a pulse, faint, but unmistakable. The light was here too, buried deep within Eldoria, calling out to her. She tightened her grip on her sword and stepped into the ruins. The first signs of resistance came quickly. As she made her way through the crumbling streets, shadowy figures began to emerge from the cracks in the stone. At first, they were only whispers, barely more than shifting darkness at the edge of her vision. But soon, they solidified into twisted, humanoid forms, the dark spirits born of the corruption that had consumed this place long ago. Aileen's sword flashed in the dying light of the day as she cut through the first wave of shadows. They dissolved into nothing with a single stroke, but more took their place. They were testing her, probing her strength, but she would not be deterred. She fought her way through the streets, her blade slicing through the thick air, until she reached the heart of Eldoria, the ancient temple of the lost light. The temple was a shadow of its former self, its once grand pillars now toppled and half buried in rubble. The entrance yawned before her, dark and forbidding. Aileen stepped inside, the air growing colder, sharper. Her footsteps echoed against the stone as she descended into the temple's depths, following the faint pulse of the light. As she ventured deeper, the shadows thickened. They no longer appeared as mere spirits but as physical manifestations of the darkness, twisted creatures of smoke and bone that lunged at her with clawed hands and snapping jaws. Aileen's blade danced in her hands, her movements fluid and precise, but she could feel the toll the fight was taking on her. The deeper she went, the more powerful the creatures became, and it was as if the darkness itself was trying to overwhelm her. But the light within her was stronger now, more than just a flicker. With each swing of her sword, she felt it surge through her, guiding her movements, lending her strength. She wasn't just fighting with steel, she was fighting with the light. At last, she reached the inner sanctum of the temple, a vast, cavernous chamber that seemed to breathe with ancient power. The pulse of the lost light was strong here, almost overwhelming, but it was not unguarded. At the center of the chamber stood the Dark General, a towering figure clad in blackened armor, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. He held a massive sword in one hand, its blade wreathed in shadow, and as Aileen approached, he stepped forward to block her path. "The light will not save you," the Dark General growled, his voice echoing through the chamber like thunder. "You are too late. The darkness has already won." Aileen raised her sword, her grip steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "The light has chosen me, and it will not be extinguished," the general laughed, a low, rumbling sound. "Then face your fate, little knight." With that, he lunged at her, his sword crashing down like a hammer. Aileen barely had time to raise her blade to block the strike, the force of it nearly knocking her off her feet. The battle began in earnest, the Dark General's blows relentless, each strike heavier and more punishing than the last. But Aileen held her ground, the light within her flaring with each clash of their blades. As the fight raged on, Aileen felt something shift inside her. The dreams, the visions that they had all been leading to this moment. The light wasn't just a tool she could wield. It was a part of her, woven into her very soul. She wasn't just a knight anymore. She was the messenger of light. With a fierce cry, Aileen summoned the full force of the light within her, her sword glowing with a radiant energy that blinded the Dark General. His sword, once wreathed in shadow, shattered under the force of her next strike, and he staggered back, his armor cracked and smoking. "You cannot defeat me," he snarled. But Aileen didn't hesitate. She surged forward, her blade slicing through the air, and with one final, powerful strike, she drove her sword into the Dark General's chest. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a deafening roar, the Dark General exploded into a cloud of black smoke, his form dissolving into the shadows. The darkness that had filled the chamber retreated, shrinking away from the light that now radiated from Aileen. She stood in the center of the chamber, her chest heaving, her sword still glowing with the remnants of the light. The lost light pulsed in the air around her, warm and soothing. She had done it. The darkness had been defeated, at least for now. But Aileen knew this wasn't the end. The darkness would return, as it always did. But now, she was ready. The light had chosen her for a reason, and she would not fail it. With a deep breath, Aileen turned and made her way back through the ruins of Eldoria. The world outside awaited her, a world still in need of the light's protection. But now, she wasn't just a guardian of the light. She was its champion,